Thank Thank you so much, Tina. Thank you. And just to alert everybody, we won't have slides tonight, so that you're not worried that you're missing out on anything. But we are going to talk about opposite action. And because, as you all know, skills build on skills in DBT, what I'm going to do is start by replacing opposite action, the skill of opposite action, in context of other skills that are helpful and that we need in order to practice opposite action. But I do want to say to you that one, opposite action is super, super effective when it is used for the right purpose in the correct context. And also that my experience, especially with teenagers, I don't work with teenagers now, but I used to. I worked in residential with teenagers, and it is one of their top 3 favorite skills. Acting opposite to the emotion is something that they love to do. And so if teenagers love it, then you know that it's a solid skill. It's a good skill to use. So I so wish I could see everybody, of course, but I'm hopeful that you're going to engage in this with me. And as I find, the reason why I'm not using slides is that I find that sometimes slides become a little too didactic, and they get in the way of us really sort of putting our minds to what is being discussed. So what I'm hopeful will happen instead is that as I'm talking, you're going to be able to take what I say and apply it to one example or to your own experience. So with that, I would like to get us started with a mindfulness practice. And I am going to ask you to look at a PDF that Tina put together for me. She's putting it up right now. And when I ring the bell, I will ask you to slowly, we have 3 minutes to do this, so that's plenty of time. I'm going to ask you to look at the first emotion up top on the left, which is aggressive. Ask yourself, am I feeling aggressive right now? Yeah, maybe a little bit. So either make a mental note of it or write it down. I'm not going to ask you any questions about it afterwards. So whatever you want to do, and then move on to the next one. Alienated. Am I feeling alienated in any way? No. How about angry? Yeah. No. Sort of do it this way, one by one, check it inside and see if that emotion comes up at all. And if it does, make a mental note of it. If it doesn't, move on steadily to the next one. All right. If there are any questions, please put them in the Q&A. I am going to ring my singing bowl 3 times. The first time is to ask you all to sort of let the rest of the world drop out. Just sort of bring yourself here with the rest of us, 166 people. The second ring of the bell will be to bring your mind to what we're about to do, to gently ask your mind to focus on this practice we are going to undertake. And the third ring of my bowl will be to actually get us started. All right. So notice taking a deep breath in, a deep breath out. Keep your hands open. Notice what is happening for you. And I will get us started. And in 3 minutes, I will ring the bell once to indicate that we're done. Thank you for participating in this. So I'm going to ask you to make a mental note of what you might have observed as you were doing this practice. What thoughts came to mind? What sensations came up, if any? And then I'm going to ask you to actually pick of the emotion. Oftentimes when people practice this mindfulness practice, they actually get sort of curious about the fact that they were able to identify more than one emotion. Like we have this impression that we're feeling one emotion at a time, or that, there's one emotion that's prevalent, or maybe no emotion at all. But when we go through this, oftentimes we notice that we're feeling maybe 2, 3, sometimes 5, 7. And that's totally, totally normative, right? So I'm going to ask you now to pick the one emotion that maybe was the most prevalent. And you might want to share it in the chat. You don't have to, but, in the spirit of real participation, go for it. And if you do choose to share, and I would ask you to sort of think about it, how strong is it? So say you're feeling hopeful right now, 0 to really not hopeful at all, actually, to 10, super, super, super hopeful. What's the number, right? So I see curiosity of 7, exhaustion of 8, right? Which makes perfect sense. Frustration, anxiety of 8. So really high, strong numbers, which makes sense because I've asked you to identify the one that is the most prevalent, meaning the one that sort of is pretty strong. We're going to get into this into a little more in a while, but for now, I'm going to ask yourself whether it makes sense that you would be feeling this exact emotion. Ask yourself, this emotion of hostility, of anxiety, of exhaustion, does it make sense that I'm feeling that emotion? So I've asked you 2 questions. Does this emotion make sense? And how strong is it? How high is it? All right. So thank you. Thank you, Tina. I'm going to let you take that down. And back to this notion of skills on skills, what I'm going to do for a quick second is share my screen and draw. Can I share? Yeah, I can share my screen. Draw something that I think all of you know. So my screen is vertical, so I'm sorry for the poor handwriting, but you all know this about, or you probably know this about what the brain does at any moment, right? At any moment, oh, look, pale blue. At any moment, the brain does one of 3 things, and it does it really, really fast, right? It produces thoughts. Again, my handwriting sucks because I'm writing vertically. So the brain produces lots of thoughts, a ton of thoughts. Remember that sentence, don't believe everything you think? Well, yeah, don't, because you're thinking so many things, and sometimes the opposite of what you were thinking a minute ago. Thoughts go around in our head all the time. Another thing that our brain does is it produces emotions, right? And the emotions are connected with the thoughts. So a thought like, this is not true, but my cat died last week, again, not true, will produce the emotion of sadness, right? That makes perfect sense. So thoughts are connected with emotions, but emotions are also connected with thoughts. Like, again, not true, I'm feeling really anxious right now. Oh, I wonder if there's the thought, right? So the anxiety, the emotion caused the thought. Similarly, what the brain does is produce urges to behave in a certain way or actual behaviors, right? And those are the only 3 things that the brain does pretty much. So we have a thought, my mosquito bite itches. The behavior is going to be actually scratching the mosquito bite, right? Then we might have an emotion. Ooh, I told myself I wouldn't scratch it. Now I'm bleeding. Thought, silly me. I said I wouldn't scratch my bite. right? So you see how it goes around in circles again and again and again. We have emotions, we have thoughts that come out of our brain, and our brain tells us to behave in certain ways. All right, I'm going to stop sharing that, but that's the basic cognitive sort of model of what the brain does. So the emotions, think back to the emotion that you identified earlier in our mindfulness practice. Our emotions come from thoughts, and then they come from our environment. They come from what we notice. And basically, how do we notice things? Well, we notice things with our 5 senses, right? So the environment triggers us in some way. We notice something, or it has triggered us. We have some vulnerabilities from our environment, and we notice an emotion. And the emotion can be pretty high at times. And why is that important for us, family members? Because, as we all know, our loved ones can read our emotions so well, or at least they get triggered by the emotions that float by. So for us to be aware of our emotions, to be literate about our emotions, is really hugely helpful. So in order to speak about acting opposite, I would like to take an example, which is only loosely based. It's actually not untrue, but it's augmented by a lot of experiences that I have observed with various families I have had the good fortune to work with. So the example I chose to use, which I suspect will connect with many of you, is that my loved one doesn't shower often. I observe that they shower once a week at most, sometimes less. They display an aversion to the bathroom in general and water in particular. And also, I notice that their room is pretty untidy, pretty messy. Not completely dirty, although sometimes dirty. Clothes and papers are strewn about, especially in non-visible places. I hope you're noticing the skill I'm using right now. The skill I'm using right now is observe and describe, non-judgmentally, right? Her place is a mess, it's awful, it sucks, it's disgusting. That would be very judgmental, right? I'm simply describing. Do you see how it already feels a little bit different, right? In order to identify the emotion. So based on this description, with a lot of items that are strewn about, especially in non-visible places, like, for example, under the bed or in a closet, and sometimes those things are a little surprising to me, like a pack of food or a bunch of computer boxes. My emotion, now that's mine, because I am who I am. It may not be the same emotion for everybody else, but my emotion in this type of environment to what I just described is aversion and dislike. So again, to be clear, this is how I respond to this. I don't like it. It's aversive to me. And those descriptors, aversion and dislike, fall in the category of the emotion called disgust, right? So disgust is probably a strong word for it, right? It's not a case of opening the door and I'm disgusted, but yeah, I don't like it. It's a push away kind of thing, which is really the emotion of disgust. So how do I know that this is the right emotion, right? We need to identify the right emotion, and we'll talk more about that. Well, I know it's the right emotion that I'm feeling. Disgust is it, because I am disapproving of this, and that's very characteristic of disgust. This state of affairs for me gives me the thought that it's unhealthy, right? It's a thought I have. This is not healthy. And also physically, I feel some sensations. I feel a lump in my throat. I open the door, and I also feel myself sort of like closing in physically, sort of pushing away. And then I have an urge to behave. So you think of that little triangle that I just put up, right? Do you see what I'm doing? I'm telling you what the emotion is, and then I tell you what the thoughts are, and then I tell you what the urges and what the behaviors might be, right? I have a huge urge. When this happens, my urge is to take everything that's in the room, my loved one included, and put everything into the wash, right? And turn the wash on. That's the urge that I feel. So how do I behave? That's the urge, but what do I actually do? In other words, what is my loved one seeing in those moments, right? Because that's what you want to ask yourselves. What am I projecting? Well, my actions are that I sort of look away, right? I mean, that's what we do when we feel disgust, when we feel that we want we want to push away what causes this strong emotion to us. I express disdain, which often happens, right? I mean, this sort of ew, which of course I know better to not say, but our loved ones can pick up those emotions, right? So I probably express some disdain. I frown. I probably use a little bit of sarcasm in my tone. I don't want to, but it might sort of be prevalent in there. Sort of like, when was the last time you showered? Or are we going to ever clean up this room? Ever? Ever? Right? So all of this is a little sarcastic, a little intense. And I pay attention to nothing else. So I might be opening the bedroom door and the bed might be made, but I don't notice that the bed is made because no, there's clothes everywhere and there's papers strewn about and there's all the stuff that causes me this strong response. It's really catching my attention. And I become sort of one-minded and a little focused on this, right? And then what do I do afterwards? I ruminate, right? Now, if I check the facts, this can be a different story. But before we get to checking the facts, which is step one of opposite action, let me turn back to you. So you all have very generously shared what emotion you were feeling and the number that you were feeling. I'm going to ask you to check in with just that emotion. Do the best that you can. It may not fit perfectly, but do the best that you can. Can you do the same thing that I just did? Can you first observe and describe the trigger? What is it that triggered the emotion that you noticed? If by thinking about this, you're noticing that perhaps the emotion that you named was not the right emotion, was not the correct emotion, can you name the correct emotion or the family of emotion? Right? So you may be a little worried or a little concerned. So the family of emotion there is anxiety, right? Or you may be frustrated, which is the family of anger. For me, I would have named it aversion, but it's the family of disgust in the example that I gave. So try to name the correct emotion. And now, as I just demonstrated, try to look at the events and how you interpret them, right? So, there's a mess all over the floor again. And then assigning cause, right? She is so messy. He is unclean, right? What is your interpretation of events? Now I'm going to ask you to ask your brain to switch to the feelings that you feel with that emotion. Feelings in your body. What do you feel in your body right now with that emotion, especially if it's high? If you're frustrated, where do you feel it? If you're curious, because I'm talking mostly about painful emotions, but there's also very positive emotions. If you're in love, lucky you, where do you feel it? Is it in your heart? Is it in your cheeks? It's a lovely emotion. And what actions does that cause you to want to take? Hint, if it's love, it makes you want to be with the loved one. It's very activating. Love is very activating. Anger is very activating as well. And as you know, in DBT and in family connections in particular, we ask ourselves, what is the emotion that's fueling anger? Why am I feeling angry? What is the emotion that's fueling the anger? Right? And that would be your primary emotion. All right. If there are any questions, let me ask Joe and Doreen. Did any questions come up in the Q&A at this point? Is there anything in what I've said so far that is confusing or no? Makes sense? Everybody's with us?
No, there's not a question. I think no, not related to the material.
Okay, awesome. So I am going to move to now the steps to acting opposite. And I'm going to change example a little bit. I liked the example of disgust because it's unusual. We often talk about shame,
Marie Paul.
anger. Yeah.
So excuse me. So one person did ask that it's if you could explain just a little bit more that what might be triggering for your person with BPD is not usually triggered in, I hate to use the word, but normal person, so how do you find that balance? I think the question exactly says, how do you deal with what you were saying to your loved one would normally not be difficult? With a BPD when it is a trigger, how do you balance the normal response that would help your BPD loved one?
I'm sorry, your voice jumped when you read the
Oh, so
question. I'm
sorry.
going to just ask you to read the question again.
How do you deal with what you were saying? So I think we are jumping ahead a little bit, but how do you deal with what you were saying to your loved one would normally not be considered difficult? But with a BPD loved one, it is a trigger. So how do you balance that normal response to a response that would help with your BPD loved one? It's
Yeah.
like living in two parallel worlds.
Well, it is a little bit. You're absolutely right.
That's what this
You know,
person's saying. Hmm.
yeah, totally. And at the same time, if you happen to, I don't know, marry somebody who is extremely allergic to, well, actually, true story. It turns out my husband is allergic to cats. That was almost a deal breaker, but I'd been married to the guy for a long time, so I decided to keep him. But, you know, I love cats. I love cats. We have a dog, right? You have to sort of adapt a little bit. So, yes, your person, your loved one who has borderline needs you to utilize some skills in order to function in a more effective way. You don't have to. But of course, if you don't use those skills, chances are they're going to not function so well. And when they don't function so well, you're not going to function so well. So the purpose of us talking about skills and holding these seminars is actually to encourage you to really sort of dive in and try to practice these things, all the while noticing that, yeah, it would be a whole lot easier to make an agreement as to the fact that if the bedroom was tidied up a little bit, everybody's life would be a whole lot easier. But there is another aspect to the question which I would like to talk about, which is that repetitive patterns of behaviors get under our skin. So in my sort of true example, not exaggerated example, let's put it this way. In my exaggerated example, if my loved one leaves their room in the way that I've described, and on the same day, my husband, who is not as neat as I am, leaves our room in that same way, guess which room is going to trigger me more? Right? Of course, my loved ones. And that's a setup for disaster, right? If I could have the same reaction with my loved one as I would have with my husband, that would be a whole lot easier. And who is that on? On me. It's on me, right? I can do something about this if I'm skillful, if I try. Okay, so that's the beginning of an answer to that question before I move on. And then feel free to come back, whoever asked this question, feel free to come back with more on this if what I'm about to talk about is not enough. So I'm going to change examples now to an example that I know for a fact works for or applies to almost everybody in the audience. And I know this because it's around the sentence that we hear most often from Family Connections participant. And that question is, if only I had known. Can anybody take a guess as to what that emotion is? If only I had known. Meaning I would have acted differently, right? That is the emotion of guilt. It has other names. We can find other names, regret, but that's the emotion of guilt. So how do we know? Let's do this tiny little exercise again. How do we know that it's guilt? Well, we know that it's guilt because guilt comes up when we did something we know was not effective. The way we behaved before we knew the skills, we now know was not effective. We know guilt comes up when in some way we violate our values. Look, it's really clear that you all are here spending an hour of your time on a weekday evening because your values are that you want your family life to be as healthy and positive as possible, right? Clearly, those are your values. And for a long time, when the skills were not part of your life, well, you didn't engage in those behaviors. So you did something that violated those values in reality, not knowingly, of course, right? You didn't know. It was one of those cases of you did the best you could at the time without the skills. We also know that it's guilt because guilt comes up when we fear that we cause harm to people we love in particular. And we are often reminded of something that we did in the past that we judge as wrong, right? So especially when we're skillful, we do something and we think, and it doesn't have the outcome that we wanted, oof, we sort of feel like we should have done something different. And that's when guilt comes up. So the thoughts of guilt that some or all of you might connect with are that we might be to blame in some way as family members, that we behaved badly, right? If only we had known. And we feel it in our body. Allow yourself, if you would, to connect with that feeling, like those moments when you think, oh, if only 10 years ago I had known this, right? Where do you feel it? Sometimes we feel it in our arms. I feel a lot of emotions in my arms. Sometimes we feel it in our face. We feel like burning cheeks, guilt, right? Joe, I see you nod. Sometimes we feel our eyes like stingy, not tears, just like guilt will cause those kinds of physical sensations. Sometimes we just feel nervous, right? Guilt will cause nervousness, jitteriness. And then what do we do about it? Well, some of the sensations come up. We lose sleep over it. That's not effective at all, but we lose sleep over it. We experience so much regret. And how helpful is that? Right? We apologize. Sometimes we over apologize. Sometimes we act in ways that go against our current values in order to apologize for behaviors that we had in the past. Not super helpful. And sometimes we ruminate about it. I did this and I did that and I should have done this and I should have done that, and it goes around and around and around. And that's not really helpful as well, right? So That's how we know that this is guilt. Do you see the effort that goes into noticing the emotion and making sure you name the emotion and you know why? Because if you act opposite to the wrong emotion, you're not going to get anywhere. So you want to know that the emotion that you're feeling is the right emotion. And then you want to start checking the facts. You want to know whether this emotion is connected with the events that prompted the emotion. In this case, I say that, yeah, the events are there. We didn't know for sure, but it is true that we wish we had acted in different ways. And many of us, when we feel this emotion of guilt coming up, we feel it pretty high. We feel it at sort of like a, 7, 8, 9, 10 kind of thing. The events were there. And then the interpretations. I caused this in many ways. If I had known, if I had been more skillful, then I wouldn't have caused this as much. No, it's not all my fault, but, I participated in this. And that's somewhat realistic. Again, we're going to talk about this, but it's not unrealistic. So we're still on the track of, this guilt could be a good candidate for opposite action. For opposite action, the events prompting the emotion have to be correct, and the interpretations have to be realistic. Okay, so we have to have the right emotion, the events have to be connected with the emotion, and they have to be realistic. Okay, so either you're following me on this example or you're thinking back to the example from your mindfulness practice. And if you have questions, you're asking in the Q&A, yeah? Then this one is important. Is the emotion justified by the facts? Is the emotion justified by the facts? Well, let me give you an example. This is a really, really important one. There is a difference between justified and reasonable. Okay, so let's imagine you walk into your office and you open the door and there's a snake. This is a Marsha example. There's a snake there. You recoil in fear. You slam the door. You call for help. Management comes, maintenance comes. They get rid of the snake. They clear the office. The office is safe. And they tell you, okay, you can now go in the office. What is the emotion you're going to experience just before you open the door to your office again? Right? Of course, you're going to feel fear. Of course, you're going to feel fear. It makes sense. There was a snake an hour ago in your office right there. You're going to open the door. Fear is going to come up. Is that emotion reasonable? Absolutely. Is it justified? Mm-mm. It is not justified. The emotion is not justified. There is no snake. It's been cleared. The place is safe. Okay, so remember this. This is really important because if the emotion is justified, then you want to act on it. Emotions are not the enemy here. In our world as families, emotions are heavy. They're hard to bear. And so we can sort of think of them as the enemy, but the emotions tell us a lot of important things. If you see your loved one, if you see your child crossing the street, another Marsha example, if you see your child crossing the street, you should feel fear, right? What you want is to not feel the kind of fear that paralyzes you. You want to be able to act on the fear. The emotion is justified and reasonable, and you want to act on it. So that's why I made this important distinction. When we're talking about the guilt here, is the guilt reasonable? Yeah, the guilt is reasonable. Is the guilt justified? Well, we didn't know, did we? We didn't know. We did the best we could with what we knew. And everybody here cares enough about their loved ones that they're here. Chances are back then, each of you cared just as much. You just didn't know. In that sense, the emotion is reasonable, but not justified. right? It's a perfect candidate for opposite action. Okay, so in order to use opposite action, you need to have either an emotion that is not justified or an emotion that is justified but too intense. Like my description of disgust, which in the conditions that I described, I would feel that way. It's probably too much. I do get to be, that it's a big deal for me. So my emotion of aversion would be like a 10, a 9, a 10. Really a 6 or 7 would probably be a little more appropriate. And we know when we overreact a little bit, right? Opposite action is great for that as well. All right. So either the emotion is not justified, doesn't fit the facts, or it's too strong or out of proportion to the facts. Okay. One quick caveat, this is just a parenthesis. Repetitive behavior will cause us to think that the emotion is justified when really it's only reasonable. Yeah. So if again and again and again, you go to your office and you feel fear when you're about to open the door, you will end up convincing yourself that the emotion is justified. So something to watch for. Just because you've been having this emotion for a long time doesn't make it very reasonable. It doesn't necessarily make it justified. Close parenthesis. All right. So if we know now that opposite action is going to be effective, you need to identify your own action urge. Remember my triangle? Emotions, thoughts, behaviors, or urges to behave. So what do I do when I feel aversion? Who knows what I do, but I know how I feel inside, and I probably do a little bit of a, puckered mouth and that kind of a face. And I feel in my body, I feel in my chest sort of like a contraction. And right, when I feel guilty, we talked about some of the behaviors, maybe over apology, maybe loosening my limits in a way to over apologize. Think of the behaviors. And I asked you that earlier about the emotion that you identified in our mindfulness practice, right? You're able to notice the urges and the physical sensations that you feel connected with that emotion. Yeah. Now ask yourself, is this behavior effective in this situation? Because maybe it is, right? Is it effective to over apologize? I can't find too many examples where it would be. And at the same time, maybe it is. Everybody is different. Every family is different, right? Is it effective for me in my state of aversion to sort of close my eyes and close the door to the bedroom? Maybe closing the door to the bedroom is effective. And then identify the opposite action. That's the next step. Identify opposite actions to your own action urges. Just because anyone else would run away if there is a snake there, maybe your action urge is to actually go in and grab the snake, which would be very dangerous to do. So you need to act opposite to that, right? But that's just you. Other people don't need to act opposite in that way. Right? My action urges when I feel aversion, the ones that are unhelpful, I need to identify them, and then I need to act opposite to them. So let's talk about this guilt of ours. How do we act opposite to guilt? We know what the behaviors are. We know what the thoughts are. And in Marshall Inahan's words, we need to act opposite all the way. Anything, any behavior, any thought that comes up when guilt comes up is what we need to target and act opposite to. If when I see my daughter and my daughter says to me, well, all the way until I was 20, you were useless. You didn't even know how to validate me. You were just, you're the reason why I struggle so much. And I hang my head, right? Which might be, for me, an expression of guilt. I need to not hang my head. I need to hold my head straight, right? If I start to feel sort of the reddening in my cheek, I need to notice that and connect it with a thought and try to change the thought, act opposite. I need to be prepared with a thought. I did the best I could. I wish it had been different, but at the time, I did the best I could. Right? Sometimes when we feel guilt, we want to run away. We feel less than. We need to act opposite to that. Some of you may have heard the expression, fake it till you make it. Next parents. Here's something that is so hard to act opposite to. Fear. Fear is so difficult. Fear just takes over, especially for those of you, families in which violence has erupted, when there's a lot of violence and, you feel fear either for yourselves and your well-being or the well-being of others. Oh my gosh, that's really hard. And you might notice, yeah, Joe, and you might notice that the urge is so overwhelming to run away. It is so overwhelming. You just want to run away. Of course, you want to keep yourself safe. The first step of acting opposite is not feeling fear. That's impossible. The first step is stay put. Observe, breathe. Observe, breathe. Just watch. Notice. You're here. They're here. You're okay. That's enough the first time. Right? It's the first step of acting opposite to fear. The long-term plan is that you are able to notice and say, ooh, this is one of those behaviors that is really causing a lot of fear for me. I'm breathing and I'm okay. I'm noticing the fear. It's coursing through my body. Noticing it. It's here. And I'm here and I'm okay. That's sort of the long-term plan, because nobody wants to feel that fear, not you, certainly, but your loved one doesn't like that either. Who wants to be feared, right? Yeah. So fear is another one that's really important, but back to guilt, right? This is a skill that you want to do again and again. So notice your action urges. Ask yourself, is this behavior effective? If it is, do it. Back to fear, if your loved one is engaging in their violent behaviors and your fear urge is to run away, run away. Don't stay, right? That is an effective behavior in that situation, right? Take cover, stay safe. But if the behavior is not effective, and I would argue that feeling guilt over something that is unjustified is not effective, then identify the action urges and act opposite to the action urges. Step number 6, and the last step, maybe the most important, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. You have to do it again and again. Your brain learned by repetition, your brain will learn this new stance by repetition as well. So it will not happen immediately. Okay, I'm noticing a question. What would be the opposite action for feelings of guilt? So you notice the behaviors, the action urges for you of guilt, which again might be to over apologize, to ruminate, to have certain thoughts of I should have done better, right? It might make you want to cry. It might, do the opposite of everything you're noticing. Because if an emotion can cause a thought, and then a thought can cause an emotion. The feelings of guilt, which is unjustified, are causing you to have thoughts and to behave a certain way in my little triangle. You want to reverse that. By acting in the opposite way, your brain is going to lower the feelings of guilt. And that is why acting opposite is so effective. Okay, so moving close to the person, being kind to the person, not over apologizing. In my example of aversion, having empathy towards the person, changing my posture, right? But again, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat.
Okay. Hey, Paul, we have an example here that I think is very common for a vast majority of people, and I was wondering if you could answer it live for us.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I just have a very fast one. When you're talking about primary emotions, is it possible to feel two primary emotions at once?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
And I had said that an example would be being sad and feeling love for someone you've missed.
Perfect example. There was a movie a long time ago called, I think, Life is Beautiful, about a dad who took his son to, who was deported to the camps, and with his son, and who was determined to not let his son know that he was in the camp. And it was the first movie that equally made me cry and laugh at the same time. It was remarkable how you can experience incredible sadness and sort of love and joy at the same time. Yeah.
And then the other one was, this is an example, I'll just read it to you. In my example, I'm feeling fear because my loved one is coming home from residential treatment, and I'm afraid I am going to revert to the old behaviors when I am in the moment with my loved one. This fear seems reasonable, since this is the first time I will be living with my loved one since I learned the skills. The fear is making me want to control everything about the home environment she is coming to, including other family members. Boy, can I relate to that. It feels like my fear is justified, but I know controlling behavior is not. So how does this person separate that?
Well, it feels like, so it's a thought, right? It's not a feeling, it's not an emotion. It feels like it's justified. You're having the thought that it's justified. It's completely reasonable that you would have this fear. It's completely reasonable. And your loved one has spent time and an investment of time and emotional effort, and you have spent time and probably a significant financial investment in residential. There should be change. There should be change. It's completely reasonable that you would be worried, and it's probably not justified. In that sense, acting opposite is absolutely the right way to go. I'm not saying that you're going to be able to eliminate fear. What I'm saying is, instead of a fear of 8 or 9, you might feel a fear of 3 or 4. And how can you function better when you're thinking, oh my God, she's coming home, or he's coming home, they're coming home, what am I, this is going to be, everything is about to start over again. Or if you're in the mindset of, hey, I'm curious to see what changes have occurred. I'm curious to see where I can see progress, right? So that's the value of regulating emotions, which your loved one should have learned, hopefully has learned in residential.
This is another good question that came up, if I can ask one more. When your head and your heart and your gut, your stomach, your gut align, is that something you normally should follow?
So, Tina, let's set up another class on Wise Mind.
Yeah.
So, you know, wise mind, emotion mind, rational mind, and then wise mind. I don't know that wise mind is only about gut. Wise mind is emotion mind, honoring emotion mind, rational mind, and also honoring your own experiences, your own values, your own life goals. And maybe all of this resides in the gut. I don't know. But when everything is nicely aligned, my experience is you know. And if you know, you're in a good place.
So Marie Paul, can you be very specific for some people like myself that are out there that are okay? So that woman's person's coming home from treatment and they're feeling fear and want to be controlling. What would be the actual opposite action to that?
So I would want a description of being controlling. So let's say being controlling is wanting your child to get up at, you know, before 8 a.m. because they used to not, but now in residential, they have learned to do that. And looking for a job because, you know, that's what young people do. They have employment and also participate in household chores. I'm just making this up. That would be your desire. That would be what you would want. And you're noticing this desire, this desire to control the situation. The argument is, let that go. I'm not saying don't expect anything. I'm saying let that go as an expression of the fear that you have, right? The fear is verbalized through this desire of control, act opposite to control. Have conversations about it. You know, let's sit down, have some tea together. And now that you're back from residential, and tell me, what are your plans? What do you want to accomplish? What have you learned? And how can I help you move forward on what you have learned in your treatment program? Do you see how that might look? I'm not saying it would be effective. I don't know, but that is acting opposite to desire for control. It's sort of relinquishing control, right? So good for you for noticing this urge to control coming up because you're 9/10 of the way there, right? Relinquishing control, open your hands, right? Work with rather than oversee. Is that specific?
Yeah, perfect. I mean, I just know that and the other person that mentioned about trusting the gut, I think what she's saying is just further explaining that sometimes it sounds like we're asking them to act opposite the gut. And I think sometimes we do. You know, I mean, it's I think that we as parents or family members sometimes just even this one, we have fears. And so we want to track their phones and we want to remove the doors from the room or things like that. I think and we do have a recording on Wise Mind for people out there. I think maybe that might be good to share it or redo it, but it's checking the facts, maybe with other people to kind of make sure your gut is really on target is, I guess, my feeling. What do you think?
Let's differentiate emotion mind from gut, right? So my gut tells me that as soon as my child is back from residential, they will go back to their old patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can see why somebody would come up would have that strong thought. It's probably rooted in fear, and it's not unreal. It's not unreal. And thanks to today, we know that while understandable, it's not justified. It's not, you know, this is not a solid piece of data that we have, right? So this is really not gut. This is emotion mind talking. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. We can totally listen to our emotion mind. Let's not forget, we also have rational mind. You know, you have just spent a lot of money in residential treatment. Something has changed. Let's keep that in mind, right?
Marie Paul, I'm looking, we have just a minute, and I just wanted to let everyone know that in the chat, I just added a link. That is a secret link that you can click
Phone
on.
number?
Yes, that is a link to all of the Family Connections Alumni Institute recordings that we have. So you were talking about your recording in Wise Mind. You have to have that link to access it, everyone. So just click on it and we will be adding more, like tonight's presentation also. We'll be adding more to that, and you will be receiving a recording. So is there any last words that you would like to
I
get?
wanted to just let people know that, Tina, the website still is not working. We're having problems with it. So if you just press on that link now and keep it open on your browser, and either later on tomorrow, that hopefully it will, we're working out the bugs right.
Yes, thank you so much, Doreen, for mentioning that. Yeah, we've been having some issues with our website, and we're working on it. So
My last words is that there is very little that is as difficult as helping somebody who struggles with severe and chronic emotional dysregulation. It is not just my words, it's proven, it's data. It's really, really hard. And you all are here. And so you all are doing your very, very, very best. And this is remarkable. We all are doing our very best. And it is remarkable. And I am in awe consistently of the work that families are doing to support their loved ones. And so I just want to say Happy New Year to all of you. I wish you peace. I will see you in another one of these seminars soon, and be well.
Oh, thank you so much, Marie Paul. You are remarkable. And yes, we would love for you to come back. I'm going to connect with you later and we will figure out another Live a Skillful Life. So everyone, thank you so much. We hope to see you next Tuesday, January 18th for Beyond FC, which is the art of the repair with Dr. Lucy Payne. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Doreen. Thanks, Marie Paul. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.